Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge our sponsors. Without this wouldn't be possible. To Straight Nature. They're the leading specialist natural history publisher in South Africa and are currently running a special for the next week, available at the Kirstenbosch Bookshop as well as online. 15% off the following 3 books. There's Kirstenbosch by Brian Huntley, the Kirstenbosch Visitor's Guide, and The Birds of Kirstenbosch. And then obviously we have Kirstenbosch Botanical Gardens and Sandby, the South Africa's premier botanical garden. It's such an inspiring and beautiful place with always something new to discover. And it's interesting for me that these talks started way back in March of 2004, together with Kirstenbosch when we hosted our first talk. And I still remember joining my first talk when I joined Room to Grow back in June of 2005. And what a wonderful journey we've had along the way. And then Room to Grow. So Room to Grow, we're an exterior design and project management company. And we've been designing and creating outdoor living spaces in and around Cape Town since 2002. We offer a complete suite of landscape design, construction, maintenance, and associated exterior design elements. We specialize in understanding and translating our clients' needs and desires to create the unique environments that reflect the individual characters that inhabit them. I just want to thank you all for joining us today on this talk, and just to let you know that the talk is recorded as well as shared live on the Straight Nature Facebook page and the Kirstenbosch Facebook page. And by registering, one of the benefits of the registration, if you're not able to make the talk for whatever reason, there's a follow-up email that you'll be received, and the live recorded link to YouTube is available for you to share and to watch at your leisure. And now it's come to the time that I'd like to introduce our speaker. It's my pleasure today to once again, I've known Alice for a while, to introduce Alice Notten. Alice is the Environmental Interpretation Officer at Kirstenbosch. She took over the post in 2001 and has been at Kirstenbosch for 29 years. As interpreter, her aim is to communicate the science behind the garden to the visitor in a simple, interesting, entertaining, and understandable way. This includes botany, horticulture, ecology, geology, and zoology. Most of the storyboards in the gardens and the information posters at the gates are from her office. She's a photographer, and as the interpreter, she needs images for the storyboards and just felt it was quicker to get those for herself. And I'm going to hand over to Alice for our talk about Beyond the Garden, Walking on the Wild Side of Kirstenbosch. Thanks, Alice.
Thanks, Brett. I presume that I'm not muted or anything?
No, you're good. You're good.
Hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, as I have been at Kirstenbosch for longer than I realized, actually. One of the old timers now. It's quite a shock. Okay. So the reason I spend a lot of my time in the garden, I've got to know Kirstenbosch, the garden part, very well. And so much of we look at the slopes beyond the garden, behind the garden on a daily basis. And I don't often get the time to go and explore them. So I thought this would be a good excuse to do so. So Kirstenbosch is a lot more. It is a garden, but it is a lot more than the garden. The actual cultivated garden just takes up a mere 36 hectares in a huge 500 odd hectare estate, which is managed as a protected area, whereas the garden is irrigated, tended, planted, weeded, fertilized, etc. The estate is pretty much left to its own devices with some interventions like alien clearing and path renovation and building. So that is the view of the estate looking north, which most of our garden maps and the way that you kind of enter Kirstenbosch is looking that way. So it's a bit weird. You've got to keep remembering that all our maps are orientated so that as you walk in the garden, it's in front of you. So for me, it is a lot easier to orientate my own brain looking the way we're facing. So this is an aerial map. It shows all the paths and yeah, it's the extent of the estate, the contour path and all that sort of thing. So it is a vast area, and we have an estate manager and a couple of dedicated estate teams that look after the estate, the wild part. And that is our garden map, which is maybe more familiar to people. It's at all the gates and things, but it is also one of the most difficult maps, and it's very difficult. We regularly get people that get lost because the map doesn't really explain the topography and the steepness, and we often, one of the most common questions is please help me, of where am I in the garden? So this also is another kind of maybe more friendly view of our estate. We've got the Cecilia boundary on the left, usually easy to spot by the bank of gums, our dam, and then the garden reaching up just to below. And then this picture doesn't take into the right. We go all the way to the Newlands boundary. Again, easy to spot by the bank of alien vegetation. Anyway, so Kirstenbosch before 1652 was used and traversed and by the people that lived on the peninsula, some of them being the Khoi or the Kuna or the Kuku, whoever they are called nowadays. Basically herder people that would use the water. We have, Kirstenbosch has perennial water. So there's a spring and there are many rivers, and we know for sure that they would harvest things like the wild almond or the bitter almond, or I can't pronounce it, but there is also a old name, Chuboinki, because they negotiated with the colonists once they were here to still get access to collect the fruits. So the wild almond grows naturally on our slopes, mainly in the riverbeds. And that is a lovely old tree on the smuts track. Easily identified by its stellate leaves, which is where its name Brabeum stellatefolium comes from. Beautiful, come out in star-like whorls, they're very beautiful. That is the early growth is quite hairy, and then it becomes this beautiful copper, and then it fades into the green as it ages. Beautiful flowers in early summer, very popular with the bees, and followed by these almond-like fruits, but they are not in any way related to almonds. In fact, they are severely toxic if you eat them fresh, and will kill you if you eat enough of them. And the old folks used to know how to treat them to get rid of the toxin, and it involves days of steeping in water, flowing water to wash out the toxins, and then they'd grind it into a meal and use it as a starch, as this kind of starch made into cakes. So that is quite a what is the word? Dominant tree on the lower slopes and along the rivers. So then after the company, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, arrived in 1652 and made themselves at home in Table Bay and forced out the Khoi people and what was remaining of the sand. So it took them about, let me see, what was 1652? I think it was 1667 by the time they got around to our side of the mountain. And our part that Kirstenbosch falls in was granted to a free sawyer called Leendert Cornelissen. So that is the first written historical mention of Kirstenbosch, where that stretch of forest was given to him to look after. And these are pictures from a little bit later, but probably very similar to the kind of tools that they would have used. So for the first, after the Dutch arrived, 100 odd years, it was just used as a source of timber. And they pretty much denuded it of all the big trees. And there was an opzichter's house. There were two actually. The older one is up in the forest, and the lower one is more or less where the manor house was built. I mean the farmhouse that also drew. But these you will see if you walk around in Kirstenbosch. They're called sleerpad, which basically means that they were used to drag the timber, and apparently ponies and things were used as well. They look like paths, but they're not. All of them are used. Not all of them are used as paths. But many of our footpaths were probably originally started by the timber the woodcutters. And yeah, so this one is on the Newland side of the estate. And they were, whether they did the digging to make the ditch or whether it was just the act of dragging that formed the ditch, I wouldn't really be sure to know. But I always feel sorry for thinking of the poor little ponies that we used to drag these things up and down, and go back up, and but like the pit ponies. Yeah, but this, so yeah, so it didn't take them long to denude the forest of the large trees, and our big trees are very slow growing. And it's, yeah, so yeah. After that, they were really just used for firewood. And the next kind of episode in our history is Van Riebeck's infamous hedge. That actually was planted quite soon into our history. I think 1660 was when it was planted, sown, started from seeds. Initially, they started a fence, a palisade wall from Salt River to sort of enclose what they considered their territory. And but because it was expensive and slow going, and wasn't going fast enough and running out of money, Van Riebeck decreed that the remaining bit that was from the Liesbeek around to Kirstenbosch was plowed and sown with wild almond seeds and brambles, thorny brambles. And this was a picture taken by Arthur Elliott, dated 1922. And these small bushes in the foreground are what he calls Van Riebeck's hedge, which is quite astonishing that they're so small, because this is a good couple of 100 years later. Anyway, but I wasn't there, so I can't tell. But those, of course, are our iconic silver trees. But by today, there are a couple of trees that still remain on our property and along the Boschheuvel. And they are beautiful, large, rambling, sprawling trees, and ideal for kids to play with. It's one of the famous kiddie places. I mean, I even remember climbing on them as kids. They are rather lovely. But they also, you will find them growing naturally all the way up Skeleton Stream, particularly along Smuts Track, up into the lower slopes. Yeah, so once Leendert actually didn't even last long himself. He was discharged from his post for around about 1661, and the land reverted back to the company, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. And nothing really much is known or recorded about what went on here until the British arrived in the 1795, 1800s, the first and then the second occupation. And they drew up maps. And on the first map, where it's actually called Kirstenbosch, this is a copy of the one, but the earliest one is 1795. And it is interesting to me because where on the map it's shown with clearly a plantation, like a cherry orchard. They call it the Kirstenbosch, and then up in the wilder part, they call the Lindenbosch. So that is one of the alternative origins for the name of Kirstenbosch. It basically means orchard, sort of fruit orchard, and that was the wild bit up there. But the top house was the original Opzichter's house. And then in 1811, it was the part of Kirstenbosch was divided and sold to the two colonial bigwigs. I forget what his actual post was, what they call it in those days, I apologize. But him and his deputy, Bird. So Alexander, he built his house, that was the first Opzichter's house, and then down to the second Opzichter, he built it on top of there, which is today where the Marquee Lawn is, where the old tea house used to stand. But Bird himself also didn't last long. I don't think he really built much of a structure, but he is credited with building our bath, like the beautiful Bird bath, or Lady Anne's bath, if you prefer. But I think Lady Anne wasn't even here yet. So I think, oh no, she'd already left, I apologize, by the time it was built. It would have been a muddy puddle when she was here. So Bird sold his bit to Alexander, and Alexander stayed here until he died in about 20 years later. I did write it down somewhere. Anyway, he had it until he died. But also, we all know that Kirstenbosch is a beautiful place. And even before it was Botanical Garden, it was well known as a beauty spot. But it's always nice to hear people agree with us. And when William Burchell was here, he waxed lyrical about Kirstenbosch. The most picturesque place he'd ever seen. He didn't even try to paint it because he couldn't do it do it justice. And he clearly was there in the afternoon, and we've all been there, and we've seen the way the sun gleams on the silver trees in that last as it disappears behind the mountain. But it's quite a beautiful little piece he wrote in his diary. And that he clearly visited. I don't know if he went and visited Alexander, whether Alexander was installed yet, whether he was just passing by. And then it was also, Kirstenbosch was also visited by Reverend Latrobe, who talked, of course, about it being wild and well-wooded, and he went to visit Alexander. The rocks of singular shape and the cascade and all that stuff, it's all very familiar. Romantic hills. And the Witterbome, which is our silver tree, is in abundance. But after Alexander died, and that was the house he built, apparently a beautiful H-shaped Cape Dutch style house, facing this east with its back to the mountain. And if you got good eyes, you can see that they're all gathered on the front thing there. It does look like a lovely house. But Rhodes bought after Alexander died, the Extian and the Cluty family farmed it until Rhodes bought it in the late 1800s, 1895. And Rhodes, unfortunately, just left it. He didn't occupy it or rent it or anything, it was just left. And the farmhouse dwindled into a sad ruin. So by the time Kirstenbosch was proclaimed, there was nothing to salvage other than they apparently used what they could to build curbing and stuff, but the house itself was unrecoverable. And the tea house was built on its ruins, but we're not talking about that today, we're talking about the estate. But also, after Rhodes died in 1912, I think, no, 1902, I apologize, he died in 1902, he bequeathed the land to the government. And the government promptly moved in and planted oaks and pines and gums and acacias everywhere, which is a great pity. But this is one of the oldest pictures we have that shows Kirstenbosch roughly at the time between being a farm and falling into disrepair and becoming a botanical garden. But that's not, the date is not really known. But the slopes look quite free of any alien vegetation at this time. But then this is 1920, golly, time does fly. And you can see already where the government had planted on the back slopes there. You can sort of see the pines popping up. So pretty much every available piece of land, they would put a pine bank or a gum belt. The garden itself, the lower part was mostly just remains of a farm, which were oaks and things. And when we did the history and looking at all these old photographs, it was funny to see familiar front version and then to see all those awful aliens looming up behind the garden, which is it's really long before my time anyway. I don't remember ever seeing them. By the time I got here, they were long gone. You can see their gums and their pines. So pretty much ring the garden and along the top towards the top gate of where we are familiar today. So that's a circa 1930 photograph. And there again, the cycad garden ringed by a huge pine plantation. But the good thing about it being pines is that it damaged the soil less than the gums, which is a positive. And then that's 1958. And those light-colored trees are poplars. So they infested the Braille Trail area as well. Like really, I mean, you can see they really got well entrenched there. And there again, more poplars. And this is the new car park, which was built in 65. Was there, and then again, bank of pines and gums, poplars. And apparently there was hakea and wattle as well. And until astonishingly recently, that was 1977, you can still see the gums are still there. And that's the newly developed protea garden done by Mr. Winter. So that would have been a familiar view of our estate, the wild part, in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, maybe even as late as the 40s. where we would see hackeias and wattles and pines and not much else. So that would have been a familiar sight. It's almost you can barely believe it that it is, and one poor sad silver tree surviving among the pines. So it's the fact that we don't have that view today, but it's this view, is thanks largely to these people and these teams of people that did all the clearing over decades. And that day they had hacking back the bramble, which is probably the same one that Van Riebeck planted that took off, and you still find it on the estate. And pretty much driven by the curator of between the 60s to 1980 was Jack Murray. But even before Jack Murray was the curator, they constantly cleared aliens. But under Jack Murray, he got a dedicated team that only did the aliens. And it was only thanks to him and his determination that we actually got the better of the aliens eventually. So this was a picture that Jack Murray took of where they started. And it is, to say that is on what we call today the lower contour, which isn't really a contour, but it's near the place that we call Donkergat, which is a terrible name, but it's where there's a dip in the deepest, darkest part of our forest. And then sort of a couple of years later, after they'd cleared out the rubus, the bramble and all the other hackeias and things, and it wasn't just a matter of clearing. You cleared and then you had to go back next year and clear again, and the next year and clear again. So it was pretty much in the annual reports from the beginning. Every report will mention how many aliens are cleared and all that sort of thing. It was just a never-ending battle. And in fact, Murray referred to it as a battle and waging war and things. And they never had enough money. They used convict labor as well before they got the dedicated team. So it was a never-ending battle. But then after they cleared all the aliens, and they would plant fast-growing trees like Virgilia, which a lot of those are. And then once the Virgilia gets a hold, then you see the understory recover. So they've marked the Virgilia as getting taller, the black mark there. And then you start to see the forest taking shape, but you're still clearing out, even in this sort of environment there, that you would still have to do a degree of clearing on a constant basis. So that's the 80s. And then the 90s, starting to look a bit better. And then by now, that's what it looks like. And the forest just gets bigger. And we that come in now can't imagine that it ever looked like it did in the 70s and 60s. So I think we owe the many, many, many people that hacked and hacked and hacked and hacked to clear the vegetation. And then the other thing that I forget to mention is that the actual planted part, the plantations, were crops in a way. So it wasn't up to Kirstenbosch to clear them. Sometimes they would get the benefit of the sale of the wood, but often it would be the government or that department that would say they're not ready, and they would leave them until they decided they were ready to fell. And it wasn't until like the 70s and 80s that they were all gone. But the pines behind the cycad garden were cleared in sort of the late 30s, as far as I remember. So then, and that was the first development of the protea garden when they moved into what was a pine plantation. But the higher up and the ones at the top of the slopes were left until quite recent, like in the 80s. Yeah, so that's the story of how we got our forest back. And as I said, it's not an easy thing. But one of Jack Murray's quotes that he said was that because when you're starting off with that bramble infested awful thing, it seems like impossible to get to this. But he was determined, and it was a lot of his determination. And of course, he was ably followed by Philip Leroux and Augustine Morkel, and now Alton Leroux, who keep going what they built on. But that to say that it can't be done, he proved that it can be done, which I think is a valuable lesson when we're looking at other restorable areas of the peninsula. It might look terrible and like a bomb scar at first, but this is what you have to keep in mind, that it can recover. So then going back onto what we have here at Kirstenbosch, just the broad thing that most of us that live here already know, that we have a Mediterranean climate, which is mild. We get very hot in February, and we get what we would call cold, but to the rest of the world is really not that cold. When the nights do dip down to 7, most of us Capetonians think we're going to die of frostbite. But I think cool is a fair assessment, with a nice mild winter and a warm spring and a hot summer. We and Newlands get a lot of rain. I think our average is about 1,300, whereas I think Newlands can go up to 2,000. It also does depend on the year. And after our terrible drought, I'll never take the rain for granted. But we do depend on our winter rainfall. And now June, July, and August are the wettest days. But we still only really get about 14 days of rain in those days, which I was also quite astonished, because sometimes you think it rains the whole winter. But in between those rainy days, we get those beautiful days like today. And in autumn and spring, it still gets a bit of rain. And in summer, each month will really only get about 4 or 5, but that always astonishes me that one of those 4 or 5 will always be Christmas Day or New Year's Eve, in my experience, just to confuse the Gautengers. So we have 4 rivers that start in Kirstenbosch, will start in the slopes and run through Kirstenbosch. We have in our kloof, so that's our backdrop basically. So we have the Falkat Kloof, which is a little river, and the nursery, which join up just below the upper contour, the 300-meter contour, and come into the garden as a nursery stream. We have Skeleton, which is our famous and best climb, or most exciting climb really, that comes down, and it and nursery join up in the garden. And then Window Stream, which is a beautiful cascade and really unclimbable unless you're mad, comes down just beside our entrance road. And then they all join up just below the garden to form the Liesbeek and flow into Table Bay. And one thing that Kirstenbosch also is that the granite ridge where our top gate is actually a watershed. And the next kloof on, which is Cecilia and Rooikat, they flow into the deep river and into False Bay. So we're a little valley, we're part of the Northern Peninsula really. And when it does rain at Kirstenbosch, it rains. And this is after one of those downpours, and I've been caught in one of those, where even if you're wearing rain gear, it's like someone turns on the cold shower and you just are drenched. It's quite astonishing. So I do enjoy the winter. And when you hear on a day like that pictured, you can hear the waterfalls roaring. It is really beautiful. And it's not often that you see it quite as bad as that, but that really was quite an astonishing downpour. And you sometimes get hail, but not really the golf balls that you get up north. But the garden is exceedingly well watered. And that is unfortunately, you can't see that from the garden, but it is very much a feature of the estate. And when you drive in, that is the Window Cascade, or the Window Gorge waterfall. It really is quite spectacular when it flows. And that is our Skeleton waterfall, which is also very, very beautiful. You can see it's big and it's quite accessible. It's even the relatively unfit can have a walk up there, but definitely not a day trip in your heels. And when it does rain, the rivers or our streams do rage. And in fact, to such an extent that I would not cross. It probably would sweep. And on some of the very, very bad days, you can hear you can hear the clonking as the rocks get moved along in the river. So that it does go very fast and quite fierce. And we are very grateful for the little bridges that have been well thoughtfully provided, because you really need to be quite brave to tackle those when they are really in spate. And just as an aside, the amber color of our streams is caused by plant tannins that leach into the water from the plant, which the fynbos is very tannin rich, which deters herbivory. It puts people, what is the word? Plant eaters, puts them off, makes it more difficult to digest. And those the foam that builds up when the water is being aerated is also not a sign of pollution. It's actually completely natural. It's just it's natural little bubbles. The trick to learn the difference is to have a smell. And if it smells nice and musty and soily, it's all right. It's when it smells chemically or sweet that you can be sure that it is caused by soap. But not at Kirstenbosch. Most of the year, the rivers are a little bit more sedate. That is the nursery stream, higher up. And in the summertime, they can dry up almost completely to a trickle, which is quite a different feel in the summer times. And now rivers, the tannins and the polyphenols also turn the water, apart from turning it amber, it also makes the water very acidic. And we have a whole array of wildlife that is adapted to the acidic water. But I'm not going to go into that. I haven't really. But that is one of our famous residents, the good old Cape River frog, which you will hear and see quite easily. We do have other frogs like the Table Mountain ghost frog, which breed higher up in Window Stream, which I've never managed to catch or to see or to anything, so I don't have a photograph of him. We have clicking frogs and reed frogs, which again, I've spent many an hour trying to track down and catch, but I've never been quick enough or sharp enough to catch one of them. But this one is an easy one to snap. And we also have our irrigation dam, which is fed by our rivers, particularly Nursery and Window, although Window really is only the top up. And I think we probably go, I think whether we are or aren't or have or haven't, we're probably going to stop that quite soon because of the Table Mountain ghost frog. But this was built in 68. And again, look at the dreadful looming gums over there. And that, of course, is our dam today. And it has, initially it leaked very badly, but they did fix that. And we have to occasionally replace the lining. Otherwise, it's good to go and keep the bank strong and everything. But this has enabled us to have lawns and to keep the garden all year round. Without the dam, gardening is a whole nother game when it's entirely water-wise. Right, and this, we call the old dam. It is a little weir that was built right at the beginning of the garden. But it is rather, it's sort of between the Erica garden and the estate. But it is a very pretty spot. And I can't imagine it has very much. Our irrigation dam is 110 megaliters. This not nearly so much. Yeah, so that's our mountain backdrop again. Now I'm going to talk about our geology, which for the peninsula is very simple. We are famously flat, of course. So we really are just stacked. We've got Cape granite underneath us, Grafwater, which is a little thin layer of brownish reddish rocks in between, and then the top gray but is the Peninsula Formation sandstone. The rest of the North Peninsula is underlain by Malmesbury Shale. We don't have much of that. We have a tiny little bit of it on the one corner where it hasn't been, where the granite pushed it out the way. But the geology is very, very old. The Malmesbury Shales, which underlie the city bowl, they were laid down so long ago that nothing with an exoskeleton had evolved yet. So it's very, very fine. And then the granite intruded into the shales around 500 million years ago. And then they were both worn flat and then became a river delta. And then the Peninsula Formation is built up on top of that. And then the actual mountains were formed when Pangaea was created and all the continents collided. And Table Mountain, the Cape Fold Belt was pushed up. And that was 200 million years ago, 230 million years ago. And since then, we've been in an erosion phase. So if you could time travel back 200 million years ago, our Cape Fold Belt would be like the Rockies, like 4 times higher than what it is today, because our highest point is Maclear's Beacon, which is only just over 1,000 meters. So yeah, so we are literally being eroded for about 200 million years or so. The easiest way, because you can't, the granite is mostly underground and the mudstone is a thin thing, is if you look in the riverbeds lower down, you will see bits of all the broken off. And the granite is easy to spot because it's all mixed up. It's got little bits of feldspar and little bits of shiny bits and black bits and things. Sandstone is the white rock. The Table Mountain sandstone is quite durable and quartzitic. And the mudstone, or the graafwater siltstones and mudstones, are that sort of quite pretty, quite reddish, what is that? Purple, I suppose, maroony color. But it's a much thinner layer. And it and Table Mountain sandstone are the bottom of the Cape supergroup. If you go further out into the Boerland, you'll find layers above it. Boekenveld shales and things go above it. So we are just the beginning start of that process. And on our estate, there are some nice geological things to look out for. So this is in the Graafwater, and it's pretty much on the upper contour, the 300-meter contour path. And they are like frozen ripple marks, but from when it was a muddy delta. And you also see mud crack patterns, which are also quite fun to see, just frozen in time there. And this doesn't look like much, it's true, but it is a fairly interesting bit. It's on, as you walk up towards Cecilia, just below the contour path there. It is what is basically talus, which is like the weathered bits and pieces. So those are sandstone blocks that get re-cemented into rock many long, and here we have a bit of iron in ours, which gives it that color and helps with the cementation. And of course, our beautiful cliffs, which tower over. This is what we call Dusty Cliff. It's quite a nice climb up there, and we see weathering in process there. Because the Table Mountain sandstone is very durable, it kind of sticks around and doesn't wash away so much. But eventually, the underlying rock, which is softer, gets weathered, or like the Graafwater gets weathered quite easily. And then these guys eventually give away just gravity. So they call it Overhang Collapse, I think. So you see these humongous blocks that eventually just give up and drop. Or you can see where they were attached. So there was a monster block that fell. A lot of them gather on the Dusty Cliff, which is quite like a boulder field below the cliffs. But some of them make it all the way down, further down the mountain, and you can see how long that one's been there, full of lichen and moss. And then that's our famous big rock at the Newlands boundary. And there are quite a few of those around if you look for them. Massive things, and cause huge destruction when they fall. But that must have also been there quite a while. And then some of them make it all the way down to the lower slopes. And that's one intrigued me because it literally is covered in lichen. So I would love to be able to age to know how long it has been lying there, how many thousands of years it's been lying there. And that growing behind it is a klipkershout, living up to its name, where they've grown together for so long that it's hard to tell where the tree ends and the rock begins. It's both covered in lichen, and it's just really beautiful. Metinus oleoides, beautiful. And that's also sort of a weathering thing, where either that's a block that's been left behind, or it's one that's tumbled from above and is just teetering there, but it does look rather perilous. Wait for the day for that one to fall, but there are quite a few of those as well. And then I don't think they were put there or chiseled like I've heard some people say. And also with Kirstenbosch, we are well signposted, although it's still very easy to get lost. And we always say if anyone does get lost, rather tell us, and then we'll plug the gap with another sign. But we do try to make signposts everywhere so that you don't get too lost. But it is a rather confusing place and easy to get lost. But as Philip LaRue used to say, it's a nice place to get lost. So where to go? Our estate is traversed by what we call, these are gravel roads. That the color and everything is thanks to our granite bedrock, which weathers that sort of rich color. Clay, it's rich in clay. We have built fords and bridges over all the rivers. That's obviously taken in summer when the river wasn't flowing, or it's flowing underneath. Gravel roads that we often call the lower contour, but it's not actually a contour. It really is just like a borderline. Whoever built it just went straight up and down and carried on. And we have well-maintained logged footpaths where the gravel roads are not. And so we take the estate team takes great care of keeping our paths in good order. Yeah, and one thing when I do walk on the lower slopes, what I enjoy most is watching how the mountain, what is the backdrop, changes, and how as you approach, you see Castle Rock, and then as you get closer, it becomes deformed, and then it disappears, and then it reappears. I enjoy that very much, and that's as you come in from the Newland side, where from the garden side you don't see all those other craggy cliffs behind it. And yeah, so that's a shot taken in summer. Maybe what we are most famous for is the silver tree, which Kirstenbosch is its home range. And even Linnaeus was impressed. He called it, I think, something like the most splendid and shining of plants. And the best time to catch it is in the afternoon rays that Burchell waxed lyrical about, where they literally do glow. And it is quite beautiful. And I've tried many times to catch that splendid shininess of them. But and that's actually best when there's a little bit of air movement, not too much light. They really are quite magical. And they are a member of the Protea family. They're in the Leucadendron genus, Leucadendron argenteum, which basically means white tree that is silver. The old Dutch name is Witteworm, which means white tree, because when the wind blows and they do shine, they do look quite white, silvery white. They're also unusual because you have male and female flowers on separate plants. That is a male, and this is the female. And the female develops into a large cone, it is large, and they keep their cones for a couple of years, if not like up to 5 or 7 years. They will keep their cones on them, and then when the plant dies, they will release all these beautiful little winged nuts, and then they grow into little plants. We also have other things. Part of the estate is the sunny fynbos clad slopes, which is mainly on the Cecilia side, and then again on the lower parts of the Lovett's Gift side, where we will see beautiful things like Erica hertiflora, which is not the only hairy flowered Erica, but it is the first named hairy flowered Erica. So when you see slopes turning purple, it's usually that one to, if you look closer, that's usually the culprit. We have the Pinea mucronata, which is a curious plant because when you look at it closely, it's sort of in fours, and the noughts and crosses comes from which I haven't really captured very well, but if you look very closely at the flowers, it's got kind of like the tips of the unopened flowers look like a little noughts and crosses game in progress. But they are from a family it is a unique fynbos family. The same as Soltera and the little brachysiphons and those that are really only found in the fynbos. This is probably the most common of them. And that is another protea, that is the Protea nitida, and that's not the flower, which is maybe one of our, invariably once a season you'll get asked what flower that is. That is the new growth, which in many proteas is that beautiful. It's the anthocyanins, which protects it from getting sunburn. That is the flower head, which is also attractive in its own right. Also very popular with insects, as you can see. And we have an agapanthus, because sometimes when you first walk up on the mountain, it does look as if some garden plants have escaped up there, but it's not necessarily the case. It's really the reverse, and that some of their plants have been co-opted into the garden. That is the Cape agapanthus, or the fynbos agapanthus. Often people will misname the common praecox as Agapanthus africanus, but this is the true africanus. It's quite a lot smaller. The leaves are more fan-like than mound-like, and their flowers are it's a smaller, thicker flower in the flower head. And they really do not do well in gardens. They like all fynbos plants, they like to have well-drained acidic soil, and too much water and too much things will rot them and kill them. But that does grow on our mountainside. Pelargonium cucullatum, which again looks like a garden escape, but it's not. It's also one of the plants they used to use for herbal things. It's good poultice, softening. The leaves can be used to soften skin, calluses, and it smells nice. Or flake Knoppiesbos also grows very well on our, particularly in the seep areas. It's always easy to spot where there's good groundwater, is where they grow. And another protea, which is probably the best at hiding, really does not make much of itself. It's a straggly, scraggly, kind of ugly bush, and it hides its flowers very effectively. But it's really quite beautiful. And that's its new growth, which also does the anthracene. That's very prevalent, especially on the Cecilia side, just above the dam. That I haven't spotted very often, but it is a sweet-scented ixia, which tends to sort of be, I think I spotted that one quite high up in skeleton. This is very common. We get a white form, a blue form, and the sort of purple form that grows scattered all over the estate. They just pop up when they feel like it. And also they're the kind of plant that it's almost impossible to tell it where to grow. It decides where it wants to grow. This is rather a funny little erica. It's very, very short. It's barely 20, sort of a 15, 20 centimeters tall, the ones I've seen. Little hairy thing. And summer flowering, like many ericas are. And this beautiful cyphia, which again, it sort of resists all efforts to get it into the garden. It just wants to do its own thing. But it has quite attractive leaves, and then at the end of the season, they withdraw all their chlorophyll, turn yellow and red, and then die back for the summer. And this also probably would do well in garden, but it's a bit kind of small and elongated is the word I'm trying to get. So it's not really a bushy little thing. And I don't know if we've ever tried to tame it, but it is lovely to see it growing around the estate. And this was after the burn, which I can't remember which burn. I think the early 2000s burn. And the Humanthus always pop up and are more obvious after the burn, although they're still there when the grass returns and the plants return. But that beautiful butterfly is our biggest butterfly, and it doesn't often come down into the garden, but it is often spotted on the estate. It's a wild, it doesn't like the garden. I've hardly ever seen it in the garden, very occasionally. And the other plant it also loves, of course, is the red crassula, which there's another, that red dicer, ferruginea, it also likes. So if you're wanting ever to catch it, you just sort of put yourself on the right side of the sun and sit patiently and wait, and hopefully it will come. And then these little things pop up. This is a Messpalathus, which, again, we haven't really ever bothered to tame. It doesn't look like much off season, but when it's flowering, it's very pretty, and it attracts these rather scrawny looking carpenter bees. I didn't look up the proper name, I apologize. But it's not as big as the regular one. And then back into the forest. So when you finish exploring the beautiful fynbos, we have thanks to Maria and his teams, we have beautiful forest, and the biggest and best trees are in the middle bit below the Donkergat area, Smuts track up to the Waterfall, and then towards Newlands. And it is quite a spiritual place for me. I enjoy it very much. The upper contour, the 300 meter, it's a lovely loop to do. You do the upper contour and then come back on the lower one. And the upper contour is a contour for a while, and all of a sudden it suddenly goes and starts zigzagging up to Dusty Clip. So it's not all the contour all the way along, but it is quite a nice cardio workout to do this one. And beauty of the forest is things like that, and seeing the peaks through the trees. And of course, we are home to the real yellowwood, Podocarpus latifolius, which is quite common, really, distinctive by its bark. And we have lots of the royals, the Pinnonia. That one is particularly like a giant, like the a claw of a bird or a dinosaur or something. It's really quite amazing. And there are quite a lot of them around where clearly the ground is dropped below them, and they're sort of left holding on as the ground recedes. And then the beautiful Castina Paragua, which it takes a while for them to show some of them. They're beautiful saffron colored bark. And the ferns, I think that one's a blechnum, and the one behind is a polysticium. I must look it up, I apologize. And we also have, right up at the top of skeleton, we have this is a rare species that only occurs on a few of our cliffs. But, be careful. Don't trample. So just a word of warning is that the Skeleton Gorge is maybe not for everybody. There are places where you will need ladders to climb the ladders, and there's one place where there's a chain, and the upper part is like a boulder field where you have to hop up and climb up and everything. So it's not an easy climb, but it's not like hugely difficult, but it does defeat some people. And Kirstenbosch, Table Mountain, this is the top of Nursery looking down. And I just want to say to the people that do venture up onto the higher part, it is, Table Mountain has a disproportionate number of fatalities it causes on a yearly, since more than Everest, which is difficult to believe. But I would say that probably the reason is that it's accessible. And I know I myself am guilty of this as kids, where you hop up, you just run up the mountain, maybe with no gear, and then we're the lucky ones and the ones that get caught in the mist, or if we don't know our way. And so anyway, so I think we must take care when we're on the mountain and respect it as a proper mountain, and remember that it's a long way down and it's steep and it has these hugely, and when the weather does fall, the ground can just fall away from underneath you. And I'm going to end on this is the left ear of Castle Rock. And when you see somebody standing on the edge there, it looks ludicrously dangerous. And but when you're up there, it doesn't feel so bad. So I think maybe just to say that enjoy the mountain, do what we can out of it, but then don't ever underestimate the mountain, and respect that it's bigger than us, and must be careful and not become one of the statistics. In fact, we just, Skeleton Gorge particularly has hurt a lot of people. So that is pretty much the end of my presentation. I don't know if Brett is still there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alice. That's wow, to have know so much about Kirstenbosch, and then to be able to have a glimpse into so much more of it, and a bit of the history and the development, and to see how that forest was sort of created. I take away that idea that the restoration is, it can and it must happen, and there's sort of proof that we were able to take what was effectively orchard and pinelands and forestry, and converted by sheer will of force into what we see today. That was a wonderful glimpse into another side of Kirstenbosch. Thank you so very much. I would like to invite everybody in the question and answer box. If you've got any questions for Alice, we can put them to her in that box, and I'll go through. So there's a bit of there's a question here already from Anita, and Anita says, I've often wondered how long it took for those trees to grow that were planted by Riebeck to be the hedge. Surely it took too long and was not effectively used as it was intended.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I think it is one of those ironies, is that maybe the brambles would have been effective, but what his intention was to make it a barrier. And but pretty much before they'd even finished sowing it, and the settlement had already spread into the Constantia Valley. So it never actually really functioned as a border. And then in later times, it was used like a toll gate. So yeah, it was pretty silly, really. It didn't really ever work as a boundary.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anita. And
but
then
you can kind of spot where the hedge is because it's away from the water. So when you do the aerial shots, you can kind of spot by their color. And if they're not growing where they like to grow normally, then when they're sort of away, that's where you can kind of spot. And it's sort of like quite a wide group of them that lie scattered that you can kind of spot them. We have a couple of them still here. And then when you get close to the stream, it's difficult to know if they were planted or already there, because we have some that were already here. But the ones that are in the arboretum are considered to be part of the hedge and planted.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Anita, for that. Another question here from Henk. Henk said, you mentioned that the original trees were cut down. What do you know what species they were originally? That would have been,
it's the same as what's there now. It would be the yellowwoods and the Curtisia. I can't for the life of me think of its common name. Stinkwood, the Olinia, the hard pear. They would have all been targeted. Anything big would have been taken out. So it's the same species that you see there now, that are just now a lot smaller. So I mean, it's astonishing when you read how big some of the ones that they cut down, but which take, you know, I mean, all of the forests, they did it to Hout Bay as well. The whole of Orange Kloof, they also took all the big logs out of there. So anything of value was taken. And then the ones that are big now were probably saplings back then, or too small to be bothered with. So yeah, so you do see them recovering, but I don't think it's still a long way to go to what the size they were when they were chopped down. I mean, the original forest.
Sure. Thanks, Henk, for that. Just a practical question here from Melanie. Just wanted to find out, do you know when the display kiosk will be displaying again?
When we have students and scholars again.
There we go.
We kind of short-staffed at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of, we're not really sure. It's always been a student function. It helps them learn the species and things. But yeah, we haven't got any students at the moment.
Just a comment here from Lynn saying, thank you, Alice, for such an informative and interesting talk. Kirstenbosch is indeed the most beautiful garden in the world, and I always enjoy visiting when I'm in Cape Town. There's just so much to see and enjoy the garden. Thanks, Lynn, that's great. Roy, another practical question here. How accessible is the estate as opposed to the planted garden, and is there a separate charge?
No, but it's the same price, whether you go into the garden or whether you're going onto the estate. The estate is just behind the garden. So things like the closest trail would be the Braille Trail, which is literally opposite the road. It's right near the garden center. And it is, if you the least fit, and the Botanical Trail is literally on the same level as the garden. So that part is very accessible. But otherwise, it is, I would say it is accessible. But the longer walks, you would need to be a little bit fit, especially in the hot months when it's hot. It does seem further and harder and more of a walk. But yeah, no, I would think compared to many other places, we do have a number of paths that lead from the garden onto the wild path. In fact, sometimes it might even be a problem where we get people that don't know the garden that might continue on what they think is a garden path and end up on the contour path. So maybe it's a little bit too accessible. So we sometimes have to put warning signs saying, hello, you are now leaving the garden, you are entering the wild path. So yeah, it is pretty easy to get to. But right. We always say, rather check the map before you go, so you don't want to bite off more than you can chew. We do have a brochure that you can get at the ticket office, which is like, I think, quite a nominal fee, like 10 Rand or 5 Rand. And it has a garden map, and it has an outlining of trails that you can follow and ideas of what to do and what you can see. Yeah. So I mean, if you're wanting to climb up Window and down Skeleton, I would set aside 5 hours. But if you want to just walk up into the forest for a bit, you could maybe do it in under an hour. And regular shoes would be fine. But and also the other thing is, be careful in winter when the rivers are running. You know, just be aware that sometimes the rivers run very strongly, and sometimes the waterfall can be quite intimidating. So you might sometimes feel like you have to turn back and walk the other way rather than cross. Okay, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Roy, for that. Another question here from Gabby. Gabby Meyer says, has a list ever been compiled of the fungi in the indigenous part of the estate? And if so, how would one get hold of it?
I would have to look for it. I think we do have lists of most things, but you can email me or Elton, and if we have it, we can email it back to you.
Great,
and if we don't have it, then we must make a plan and get it done.
That's great. Thanks for that, Gabby. And I think there's not many more questions in the box. I think maybe just a couple more thank yous from our attendees today. From Ilana Barling says, thank you so much for a fabulous talk. I delayed my visit to Kirstenbosch and it was well worth it. I'm leaving now for the UK, but we'll look in with new eyes. Thank you so much for the talk. And one more here from Cherry. What a privilege to walk on the wild side. Thank you so much, Alice, for sharing your experiences, which are unattainable for so many of us, beyond expectations. Thank you. So thank you, Alice. Again, that's really, really, I think you've shown us a lot of information and taken us to a part of the garden that has been alluded to there that not many people have got to get to and will get to experience, especially our visitors who aren't in South Africa or even in further flung places than Cape Town. And then before we close, I'd just like to remind everybody that our next talk will be in 2 weeks' time. That's the 23rd of June. It's Mitch Reardon, and the topic is Shaping Addo, the beauty behemoth. And a final thank you and acknowledgements. Thank you again to Alice for her wonderful talk. Thank you to Belinda and to Kathy, without whom none of this would be possible. Thanks again to our sponsors, Straight Nature. Remember the 3 books that are on special this next week, 15% off: Kirstenbosch by Brian Huntley, Kirstenbosch Visitor's Guide, and The Birds of Kirstenbosch. And thank you, of course, to Kirstenbosch and Sandby, and again to Room to Grow. And to all of you who've attended the talk, I wish you a blessed day further. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you so very much, everybody. Bye.
Thanks.